If you were to take a bunch of 90s tropes, put them in a blender and grind them all up, chances are what you'd be left with is something like ToeJam Earl. A groundbreaking video game title for its time, and one of the earlier releases for Sega's 16-bit Genesis console, the unique mixture of the game's decidedly offbeat humor, overly cartoony characters, and a soundtrack inspired by the early days of hip-hop not only make it a perfect snapshot of early 90s culture, but its unique gameplay and design also allow it to stand out amongst the saturation of video game titles from that era. While it's easy now to say that the game is a classic due to the exposure it's received over the years with several re-releases on various compilations, as well as 3 sequels to boot, upon its release, it failed to catch on with some consumers due to its unconventional style. Heck, the sequels that did come out even contrasted greatly in structure to the original game. The second game, Panic on Funkotron, was a huge departure from the overhead view of the first game. It's a 2D side-scroller, and while it's a good game and acclaimed on its own, it really was a huge deviation from the first title. The third game, Mission to Earth, was a 3D platformer, albeit one that borrowed much more from the original game's objectives, but it was still different enough that it'd be hard to argue that it really was a true follow-up to the 16-bit original. It wasn't until the fourth game in the series, 2019's ToeJam Earl Back in the Groove released, that finally the groundbreaking yet experimental formula of the original game would be revisited. So did this sequel/reboot of the original game recapture what made the original great, plus improve on it? Or was ToeJam Earl better off just being left back in the past? This is Versus, a segment where I take 2 video games, could be a game and its sequel, or just 2 games from which many correlations can be made, and I compare and contrast the 2 to see which one is the overall better choice. Today it's old school against new school. It's ToeJam Earl versus ToeJam Earl Back in the Groove. First things first, let's see which title has the best gameplay. The original ToeJam Earl is a game that's difficult to categorize due to just how unique the gameplay is. In all reality, the game's objectives are basic. ToeJam Earl's aircraft, the Rapmaster rocket ship, has crash-landed on the planet Earth. Now it's your job to find the 10 pieces of TJ Earl's ship so they can rebuild it and fly home to their home planet, Funkotron. Sounds pretty simple, right? Well, it's not really quite that cut and dry. While the world you traverse isn't broken up into stages like lots of other games, it still has a somewhat traditional gameplay structure. ToeJam Earl's game is broken up into islands. You get to these islands by traveling in elevators. Each island acts like a different floor that you visit. On each of these islands or floors that you arrive at, your objective is simple. All you're really obligated to do is find the exit elevator to the next island. If the island you're visiting has a piece of TJ Earl's Rapmaster rocket ship, the game will notify you of this as you get off the elevator. In this case, you want to not only find the elevator to the next island, but you also need to find the missing piece of your aircraft. There are several Earthling enemies who want to keep you from doing this though, and that's where the game's difficulty comes in. Enemies range from the rather simple variety like a mother and a baby in a shopping cart, mad scientists, and demons with pitchforks, to some which are a little harder to avoid like these cherubs whose arrows screw up your controls, moles that steal your items, and mailboxes which come to life and are pretty much impossible to avoid. You can fall off the edge of these islands too, in which case you'll simply return to the floor you were on before. It's a serious drag. Well, given all that, you might ask yourself, what means do TJ and Earl have to traverse these vast lands to find the parts and reach the exit? They can't jump, they can't run, heck, they can't even attack. TJ and Earl themselves are not very versatile, and that's where the present system comes into play. Scattered throughout the world are gift boxes that contain items. Some are ridiculously useful, like the high-top sneakers that let you run fast, which is a must because TJ and Earl by default travel like tanks. Another useful gift is the Icarus wings that let you fly across great spans of levels. Some are a bit less useful, like the spring shoes, the slingshot, and a blow-up dinosaur, which is extremely circumstantial, but it does let you float across the water easily. There's even TJ and Earl balloons which distract the enemies. Then there are presents which don't aid you at all but actually hurt you. There's an item which pretty much zaps all of your health, rocket skates which can seriously screw up your game because they move so fast and mix up your controls that it's impossible to not fall off the island you're on. A a rain cloud whose thunder strikes will shock you to death. There's even doorways which either take you to safety or some place where you're screwed and your only option is to fall off the island. You might say, why would you even open those gifts at all? Well, most of the presents you pick up are mystery items. You can pay a guy in a carrot suit to tell you what they are, but it's a bit of a ripoff. ToeJam Earl thankfully features a health bar, as getting hit in this game is pretty much inevitable. Food items are spread about the islands to refill said health bar, but some foods actually hurt your character because it makes them sick. Also along the way is cash, which you can collect to buy more gifts or pay for the services of friendly earthlings. Just like the presents, the services the friendly earthlings offer range in usefulness. You can pay to be fully healed, which is certainly helpful depending on your situation. You can seek out the help of a giant Viking woman to follow you and she'll trample enemies. You can even bump into Santa Claus and he'll give you a bunch of gifts. There are a few more eccentricities to cover, like the map, which is insanely helpful. The islands are built on grids, so as you reach a new area, it becomes uncovered on the map. The map is key in revealing the locations of elevators and spaceship parts. If you happen to pick up a ringing telephone, more of the map will be revealed without you actually having to visit that part. I only kind of wish you could see the map at all times, like maybe having it be in the corner instead of having to pull it up. But with the low resolution of this game, I don't know if that was really feasible. The last aspect of the gameplay to cover is the terrain of the island itself. There are hidden paths you need to reveal, often to get to where you need to be. There's sand that slows you down and makes you sink, and there's water that you can technically drown in, but I found it rather useful in avoiding enemies. With all that said, that's pretty much the gameplay of ToeJam Earl. It's a bit overwhelming at first, and without a manual it can be really hard to tell what to do, but once I started really playing it, it resonated with me. Since the worlds are randomly generated, the islands you visit have pretty much just enough variety to keep a gameplay session from being monotonous. It can get pretty ridiculous how many floors you can visit without seeing a ship piece at all, but overall, for a title released in 1991, it's a pretty solid game. It does something new and it does it pretty well. ToeJam Earl Back in the Groove then has some odd shoes to fill. For one thing, it's got to translate a 28-year-old game to something that's acceptable by today's standards, but it also has to come up with new ways to improve the established gameplay to satiate newcomers and those familiar with the original game alike. Does it do so? Well, let's find out. First things first is that this game offers a tutorial mode which pretty much tells you everything you need to know about how to play and what your objectives are. This not only helps you understand this game, but the series in general. Seeing as this is a continuation of the gameplay of the first game, if you're familiar with the original, you'll notice that not all that much has changed, but the gameplay has been fine-tuned and given much needed features, and it makes the experience feel a little bit more connected as a result. The gift system is back, the food is back, and even the friendly earthlings are back. They even sparkle now so that you know for sure they are your allies. Pretty much everything from the original is here. The only missing elements were the hamster ball enemy and the bee swarms, which honestly were so frustrating in the original, I'm glad they were cut. New and exclusive to this game then are some new mini-games like the hip-hop rhythm mini-game, which is kind of reminiscent of something like Guitar Hero. Sometimes you even get to create your own beat. There's also the new dice rolling task, which is a game of chance, sure, but the risk versus reward aspect of it make it worth playing. These both help you earn prizes and cash, and overall items themselves just seem way more plentiful than they were in the past. Sunflower patches have been added to the game which you can hide behind, and the bad earthlings won't see you at all. And now ToeJam Earl can interact with houses and shrubs and the like to reveal hidden items. Some elements from the second and third titles even made it into Back in the Groove, like the Hyperfunk Zone from the second game and the sushi stand from the third. TJ and Earl are now capable of leveling up and moving up in rank too by talking to the carrot suit guy. With these upgrades, your character can be made to move faster, given more health, or various other little boosts to their overall abilities. Progression is rewarded kindly too now. Lots of content is locked from the start of the game, including extra characters which you can unlock when you beat the game, and even the randomized mode, but it's very easy to unlock. One pleasant surprise came when I saw that my biggest complaints with the original game's core gameplay were addressed. For one, the map is always visible on the screen, and secondly, the overall pace of the game has been picked up considerably. Now instead of slogging through 5 to 10 levels before you see a spaceship part, parts appear every second or third floor. I also enjoyed the uptick in stage and hazard variety as well. Some of the new enemies made me laugh simply for how over the top and stupid they were. Seeing some new stage styles like snowy worlds and nighttime levels were also a very welcome addition in my eyes. Overall, I'm very happy with the steps they took to make this a reasonable evolution of the original game, and I think the new features don't take anything away from the established formula, but simply add to it. It should come as no huge revelation then when I say that I think Back in the Groove offers the best gameplay overall. While it's pretty much expected that in the near 28-year gap between Back in the Groove and the original, a lot was learned to fix and elevate the gameplay, all of the shortcomings I felt the original game had were addressed in this sequel. In terms of gameplay, Back in the Groove tweaks and refines everything enough that this formula works about as well as it ever could. Next, let's cover best visuals and aesthetics. I really love the visuals of the original ToeJam Earl. There's just something fabulous about the look of all the sprites in the game. Considering that the sprites themselves are rather small in size, the artist managed to cram a lot of expression into these characters. You've also got to hand it to whoever actualized the animations too. Look at Earl's strut, it's freaking awesome. I also love how TJ looks like he's sort of doing a little jig as he walks around. You can somehow make out every different character's intentions by looking at them, and the enemy animations are top notch. You can tell good guys are good guys, and you can tell bad guys are bad guys. Aside from the in-game graphics, I found the intro to be especially enjoyable. It's told in maybe the most laid-back fashion possible. A simple conversation between two characters. It explains how Earl wanted to pilot the Rapmaster and how they could trade places so he could do so. Get a load of that sunglass lift. The smarmy confidence on display there almost makes you glad he ends up wrecking that ship into planet Earth. Despite being rather slow and none too flashy, the intro sets a nice precedent for the style the game was going for. The post-game content is also fantastic. When you skip your ship across the water and arrive back on your planet Funkotron, the lively greeting from all of your alien kin gives a stark contrast to the rest of the visuals in the title, which are a bit drab if you ask me, as the rest of the backgrounds in the game are mostly just areas of blue and green. Following the yellow brick road is immensely enjoyable as you see all the cool and strange species that inhabit TJ and Earl's planet. Makes you want to take your time before you finally get to see your family again. I also really love the elevator transitions between islands. Each one is so quintessentially 90s, I almost feel like I've gone back in time and turned Nickelodeon on. Whether it's the overly cartoony animations, the flashy backgrounds, the goofy Sega intro screen, even Earl's cockiness when he's piloting the Rapmaster, it all matches the exact feelings invoked by looking at the game's cover art. Considering this is a 16-bit game, that's quite an accomplishment by the game's artists. Conversely, I can't honestly say that Back in the Groove remotely lives up to the visuals of the other games in the series. Even in trying to match the cartoony look of 90s cartoons, it still kind of falls flat. Look at the intro. If I had no idea this was a ToeJam Earl game, I probably would have turned it off. I mean, the only 90s feeling this intro invokes is a poorly animated flash cartoon you might get as an email attachment in 1999. Even the voice acting sounds pretty cheaply done, and I can't honestly say I'm a fan of it at all. That being said, at the very least, the visuals of the rest of the game don't try to emulate the intro's particular style, thank God, but I sort of found that they fall flat on their own. Characters no longer move with any rhythm or unique jigs, but rather look like dolls rigged up with lifeless animation cycles. It's not a look I'm wholly opposed to if the game was a Flash game from 2003, but for a game trying to look and feel like something from the 90s, and in terms of living up to the precedent set by older ToeJam Earl games, it's hard to get used to. Instead of targeting the classic look of, say, a classic Scupo cartoon, it instead looks like every other 2010s era Cartoon Network production. I can tell they were sort of trying to go for a hand-drawn look, and the effort is somewhat commendable, but it doesn't really look great. I dare say it's one of the less attractive titles I have ever played in the HD era. Everything just feels lifeless and drab compared to what the original game had on display. Even the characters themselves are pretty unattractive. I think they knew this too because they included old school versions of TJ and Earl in the game, which given how much better they look, I think they should have just tried to target this aesthetic instead. Looks aren't everything though, and it's not like the visuals detract from the gameplay itself. The art production just definitely doesn't feel as well executed and doesn't scream 90s like the original. So the best visuals and aesthetics go to the original ToeJam and Earl. Pixel art is very attractive and sexy and still holds up pretty well today. All of the game's cutscenes and animations go above and beyond in making it live up to its early 90s roots and being a well-crafted product of its time. Every character gives it unique visual identity, which is very hard to do given the size of the sprites and the limits of the Genesis hardware itself. Next, best multiplayer. Cooperative gameplay may not have been nearly as important or common in console games of 1991 as a game title released in 2019, but despite this, the original ToeJam and Earl has a fairly competent multiplayer mode. In multiplayer, two players can enjoy the full game experience by exploring islands and collecting gifts and parts as a team. You can either stick together, which I recommend because the screen stays in its full screen form and it's easy to get lost if you get separated. In the event that you do get separated though, the screen will split in half and you can go about your business on your own. The issue with this is all the sprites stay the same size and it becomes a screen crunch, which makes it a lot more difficult to see what's going on, and being blindsided by enemies that you normally could see is inevitable. Those limitations being known, it is worth mentioning that the game compensates for having two players together by increasing item drops and gifts and the like. Really though, the game isn't without its limitations in cooperative gameplay. For instance, if you want to move on to the next floor, you have to wait for the second player to arrive at the elevator so you both can go together. You cannot travel to a new floor on your own, which is surely a drag, especially if your teammate fell off the island and you have to wait for them to get back to your level to the elevator ship. This goes back to my point that I believe it's just easier to stick together. If you stick together, one player can lure enemies away while the other one goes to collect items. We're not done going over multiplayer modes though, as there is one other cooperative option in the game. It's called Jam Out mode. In this mode you select a music track from the game, and then after that you mash buttons to make TJ and Earl dance to the beat. This is most certainly fluff content for the game, as it's not necessary at all, but it is funny the lengths the developers took to put something like this in the game, solidifying it as forever a product of the early 90s. Given the scope of the game and the glut of other content, it's harmless. ToeJam and Earl Back in the Groove unsurprisingly has couch co-op available as well, and it's pretty much identical to the original game. Thanks to the higher resolution in the game, the viewing area doesn't diminish as much in split screen mode, but some other aspects I thought they'd fix in this release are still problematic. The game still has a limitation that both players need to get on the elevator in order to advance to an unexplored floor. In that sense, it doesn't seem like much of an upgrade to the original, and really it isn't, but the game performs well in split screen mode, and aside from a couple of stutters here and there, isn't flawed outside of that. Where I think this game shines and the developers really took advantage of an opportunity is the addition of online play to the game. You could play online with up to 3 others at a time, and it's available to jump in with pretty much any mode in the game. It's easy to toggle a status screen to see how many players are in the game at a time, plus you don't have to deal with the limitations of split screen at all. Other little additions include being able to give your teammate gifts if you have an overabundance of them. Really, the addition of online play and being able to drop in and out of the game in progress is a great forward step, and the gameplay of ToeJam and Earl Back in the Groove pretty much makes for a better online experience than it does for a couch co-op one. I'm going with Back in the Groove for the best multiplayer. In most ways, the actual couch cooperative 2-player experience isn't greatly enhanced by this game, but the ease of jumping into an online game and the general amount of fun it is to play with another player without the limitations of a split screen make it pretty much my preferred way to play the game overall. I think now I've covered enough to make my final pick for the better of these two. The winner of this episode of Versus is ToeJam and Earl Back in the Groove. Once you get past the floaty flash animation aesthetic and the overall unappealing visuals, the gameplay is a huge improvement. It's a big enough one over the original to make it a bit easier to recommend, especially if your first exposure to this series is this game. The tutorial mode does a perfect job of explaining the abstract points of the game, and little additions here and there make the game more accessible and easy to follow. The new online mode is fantastic, and the level up system and extra content in the game make replaying it less of a chore. In terms of recapturing that 90s nostalgia, I can't really say it does that well, but in terms of taking an established gameplay formula and tweaking it and expanding on it to near perfection, it does a great job of that. If you're looking for something interesting to play, this is a very easy game to recommend. The original ToeJam Earl, then, is intriguing simply for how awesome the visuals and style of the game are. It's got flaws, yes, but those are easily overlooked by the overall attractiveness of the game. Its unique style and gameplay are ridiculously impressive for a game released in 1991, and even today stand out as one of the more unique games in the Sega Genesis' library. If you're looking for a fun game that'll transport you back to the early funky fresh era of the 90s, and don't mind a few limitations in the gameplay department, this game is for you. All that being said, these are just my subjective views, so which game do you like better? Leave a comment if you so wish, and as always, thanks so much for watching this episode of Versus. Check back later for more.